Interestingly, we were all holed up in a five-star hotel that we couldn't leave. So unless we were going on patrol, we were stuck in this hotel. And that's a very weirdly claustrophobic sort of setting, because not that far were the rebels' artillery positions, and they'd fire these multiple launch rocket systems kind of over the hotel. I mean, there's no chance of hitting us. The arc is too high, so they just kind of arc over. But you sort of have we call it nightly fireworks. And it's amazing how quickly you become habituated into that as not being a threat to you, because you know it's being fired over you, and then it becomes a point of amusement. Obviously, that's insane.
This is Andrew Vance, and you're listening to Choose the Hard Way, where I explore lessons learned at the limits of human experience with top performers from tech, business, the arts, science, the military, and many other disciplines. If you enjoyed this episode, please subscribe and give us a 5-star rating in the iTunes store. If you'd like to suggest a guest or send feedback about something new or different you'd like to hear on the show, please email me at choosethehardway@gmail.com. And you can also catch me on Instagram at HardwayPod. There aren't shortcuts or hacks on the road to becoming the best. You are what you overcome. Choose the hard way. My guest is Samir Puri, a defense policy and counterterrorism expert. Samir has worked in government and in academia, including as assistant head of research at the British Ministry of Defence's think tank. Samir was raised in 1980s London in a family that had traversed 3 continents and 3 generations, from Asia to Africa to Europe. Samir later completed a PhD at Cambridge University in International Relations, worked at RAND, and then the Foreign Office, where his assignments covered counterterrorism, and a year in East Ukraine, monitoring the onset of war in 2014. After government service, Samir became a lecturer in war studies at King's College London and also taught at Cambridge and Johns Hopkins. He has since left academia and in 2020 was appointed senior fellow at the International Institute for Strategic Studies in Singapore. Samir's previous books include Pakistan's War on Terrorism and Fighting and Negotiating with Armed Groups. His latest book is Shadows of Empire: How Imperial History Shapes Our World. In this interview, we cover a wide variety of topics, including hybrid warfare, theories of conflict, violence, human nature, creativity, sport, and Metallica. Go to SamirPuri.com to learn more, and you can follow Samir on Twitter at PuriSamir1. You can find those links in the show notes.
Yeah, so my career has oscillated between doing quite practical things and taking a step back and writing books. And, I've just released a book, it's just being published. And when that was done, rather than going straight into another book, I want to get out there and go do something. And actually, one of the biggest issues in the world today is rise of China, right? Everyone's talking about this, whether in the States, in the UK, whether in East Asia. And the job I've got is working at a think tank that works on strategic issues, security issues, and convenes these big diplomatic events involving defense ministers from the region. And I've got a role to do some research here. I've got a role to help run these events. It's a real interesting sort of grand, sort of ringside seat to this coming clash between the West and China. Singapore's kind of in the middle, one of those countries in the middle. That's why I'm here.
And as you mentioned, there's this balance between doing the book work, doing deep, I'm sure you're doing deep thinking all the time, but working on books and then things that are more on the application side of this knowledge. So how do you find that balance, and how does that work within your career? Oscillating back and forth between kind of these two different modalities.
Yeah, it's no career structure is set up for that. I kind of liken it a bit to, that famous boxing chess where the guys box and then they go out and they play a round of chess and keep alternating. Not quite that extreme, but, the way it works is I've actually resigned from quite a few jobs out of no ill will, just more the sense of I feel like I've done what I want to do here and I'm going to switch mode. I'm going to go do a different sport now. And, I've always worked on international affairs, security affairs, but rather than being stuck in a library and just thinking about this stuff, or only being responsive to events. I've actually found it really rewarding to spend a few years in responsive mode, then a few years in sort of contemplative mode. But I guess the final thing to say on that is it's also the winds of fate, isn't it? Depends on which opportunities present themselves and also what's happening in the world. Because I've always felt like I want to be somewhere where the action is. That doesn't mean to say in a fatalistic way, but just somewhere that's actually part of what comprises of the headlines of the moment.
When do you know it's time to go? Because looking at your career, you've had some incredibly prestigious postings and jobs. So when do you know that it's time to go do something else? And is it hard to walk away from something that's very prestigious and probably very rewarding that you've been doing?
Well, so I suppose sometimes it's because your line manager or boss at the time starts to look at you and sort of sees that you've got itchy feet and you're getting into trouble in the workplace. But otherwise, it's actually I'd probably say as I don't want to sound wishy-washy, but it's a bit about your own imagination, your own sense of where you want to be in the world, and never letting the way in which a career structure defines your fate to start to limit your imagination. Your imagination is a really sacred thing, and it's obviously we start to lose it ever since we leave childhood, right? Because the realities of the world descend on us, and we get railroaded, and it's not anyone's fault. That's just the way life is, right? But we'll talk about this. I'm sure I've been an academic. I've also been in the civil service. I did some time in a war zone, and obviously writing books, all before getting out here. And I guess it really comes from within. Like, do I want to be here? Do I want to be doing this? Am I getting something out of this? Am I making a contribution? And knowing when to leave a party is a really, really important skill. I sort of joke with my friends, you don't want to be the last guy at the bar, at 3 a.m. with the last drink. You've got to spot that. I define maturity as, I'm getting through my 30s very rapidly. I define maturity as spotting the last drink at the bar that you should never have, the drink of no return, and taking that analogy back into the workplace. Like, which is the year that you'll look back on and go, that was a wasted year, and try and leave before you've lived that wasted year. It's easier said than done, I think.
And you mentioned creativity as a driver. And what are the things that you do to capture your creativity or to cultivate it? Because personally, when I think of people who are operating in think tanks or on the policy side doing things related to defense, what they're doing is highly creative, but I don't necessarily always think of that as being analogous to other forms of creativity. So like, how does creativity exhibit itself in your profession, and like how you approach the way you think about what you're doing next?
That's a question that can only really be answered based on which of my various incarnations I've been in. Because when you're an academic, and before coming to Singapore, that's what I was doing for about 4 or so years. You can do the classic blue skies thinking. You can write an article that no one's ever going to read, but you found it quite interesting, right?
Right.
And then sometimes when I've been in very disciplined settings or trying to deliver a book, I've sort of written a sort of a fun article just on the side, just for myself. I wrote, just to give you one example of how completely out of it this was, nothing to do with my career, and I don't mention it on my CV. I wrote an article about sort of getting older and sort of the changing aggressive impulse in young men going from your 20s to your 30s to your 40s, and how that sort of evens out. And the analogy was with heavy metal bands, which is what I used to listen to as a teenager, as in, why do bands start to become a bit softer as they get older? It's got nothing to do with my career. Wrote it, enjoyed it, and just put it out there for probably no one to read. And it's just a great way to get yourself thinking about an association between, in this case, getting older and artistic expression, then back to the grindstone of writing your PhD or your book. And that doesn't give you the short-term reward like just pumping something like that out.
I haven't found that article in the course of my research, but I'm definitely going to want to get that link from you, and I'll include it in the show notes. And now I want to know, like, which heavy metal bands were you listening to when you were younger?
Well, if I wasn't working in sort of national security or international affairs, my ultimate dream would have been to be a musician. But sadly, I'm musically untalented.
So you didn't.
It dries my throat out.
Yeah.
Excuse me. Sorry about that. You'll have to make a cut there. So I mean, the classic like Metallica and Iron Maiden, that sort of thing. But interestingly, everyone's sort of career starts from somewhere, right? If you do a career you're passionate about. And I used to listen to this metal music as a teenager because it was the only music that had lyrics about things I found interesting, namely history and war and conquest, all these kind of masculine themes that appeal to prepubescent kids. That plus the classic other thing of you're a kid and you like toy soldiers, right? It was no more complex than that, and that's what gives you that sort of sense of, well, these are interesting themes for me. I find that there's something interesting in there. Then, of course, when you're getting a bit older, you want to transform those sorts of quite immature interests into something that's potentially worthwhile. And I really think working in national security is worthwhile because God knows there's lots of threats out there, foreign and domestic, as they say in the States. And if you're going to dedicate your life to thinking and working on themes, and thinking and working on themes around things that actually are making the world less safe, are making your country less safe, I think that's a really rewarding thing to do. But it started from a very, very sort of immature and innocent sort of place of playing toy soldiers. But I think that's true for a lot of people who work in national security.
I wanted to dig into that, but first I want to know, what's your favorite Metallica album?
Ride the Lightning, unquestionably. With Creeping
I would agree.
For Whom the Bell Tolls, a bit of Hemingway inadvertently quoted in that one. That and probably And Justice for All. Those are my two.
Yeah, those are.
I think we get to that topic on this podcast.
Yeah, I would agree. Those are definitely the best albums. I also would say I would put Ride the Lightning at number one. But yeah, I'm curious. Like, going back to your childhood, like you said, young men are often fascinated by the idea of violent conflict, of war, playing with toy soldiers. I mean, again, like, not everybody's into this stuff, but certainly for me, there was a huge part of my childhood. I probably checked out every book about World War I, Green Berets, like whatever. I've actually tried to go back and find some of the books that I read obsessively when I was in like kindergarten to fourth grade. I can't find them all, but I found a few. What was that like for you? And like, did that then inform what you ended up doing and who you became? Were those topics something that was just like really, really deeply resonant beyond what a lot of people probably experience?
Yeah, do you know what? I think in a different time and a place, if we were in school at the same time, we'd have probably been friends at the age of 10, because that's exactly what I was doing. Now, I've thought about this because I'm the least warlike guy you'd ever meet. I'm not even that big physically framed, not particularly good at sports. So it wasn't some sort of, macho, trying to test myself thing. There was something very innate about the themes of being a warrior, of masculinity, of the epic scale of the events against which this equipment or these uniforms or these soldiers or these events were sort of unfolding. World War II being, the ultimate, it's mind-blowing when you're a young child to read about the 6 years of World War II. I grew up in London, so of course for us a lot of it's about the Battle of Britain, the Blitz, Churchill, for you guys in the States, Pearl Harbor and coming in, all those themes, and watching the films. I mean, it really transported me to somewhere else. And another part of that was I grew up in the sort of late 80s and the 90s. There were no real threats to the UK. I kind of missed the Cold War, right? And I was a bit too young to be a child for 9/11. I was at university by that point. So I suppose it all seemed a bit abstract as well. But I don't know why these themes were captivating. I've got nothing in my family background that relates to conflict. I wasn't really introduced to anything in relation to those themes at all. But it completely transfixed me as a child. And it definitely, as you're sort of alluding to, then informed the sorts of things I thought were worthwhile working on later on. But I think, forget about the national security and the military part of it. That's kind of what you want, isn't it? If you want to, when someone says work on something that reflects your passions, well, your passions probably were informed from quite a young age. And they have to evolve from there. But there's probably that kernel of sort of imagination, like the first time you discover something. That's surely where a lot of what we consider to be our innate passions comes from, I think, anyway.
And for you, how did it transition from being a passion or an area of deep interest into, I think this is going to become my career? Like, when did you know that was happening for you? So
dead simple. Everyone has a slightly crazy teenage year period, as we sort of talked about. I was listening to a lot of metal bands, and they were still talking about history as well, and a lot of the themes. And I loved history. I loved reading the books. And so it was really at 17 years of age, when you're picking your university subjects, without a shred of a doubt, it was going to be history. And when I got to university as an undergraduate, I really picked the themes to do with the Nazis and World War II, revolutionary Russia, everything that related to those events and those episodes, those parts of the world. And I studied the Middle East, security to do with the Middle East. And that was really at university.
And as you got deeper into your career and then started getting into writing and publishing more, this is something I'm always curious about when I talk to authors, is of the vast range of things that you could focus on within your area of expertise. How did you land on, like in the case of your current book, why this topic? Why now? Because when you're an author, you're going to put several years into producing a piece of work of this caliber, of this depth. So why did you want to make this commitment? Why this topic?
Yeah, so this book has got the Shadows of Empire, as it's called in the States, and the Great Imperial Hangover, as it's called elsewhere. Apparently, the American market doesn't like the sound of a hangover, so I'm told. I'm not sure I believe that, but that explains the retitling. So this one's got nothing to do with my PhD. PhD was on sort of counter-terrorism themes, and I'd done that, and I'd worked on that professionally as well when I was working in government. And the last job I did in government, and we can talk about this in a bit, was in the war in Ukraine. I spent a year in East Ukraine as part of the diplomatic mission. I just came back from that. And because of the way Russia had approached the issue of Ukraine, which was to annex Crimea, which they basically conquered it in a very sort of imperialistic fashion. This is in 2014. This sort of thing just doesn't happen anymore. Everyone will remember that Saddam Hussein tried to cleave off Kuwait in 1990, but a year later, US-led coalition, Desert Storm, they'd kicked him out and Kuwait was sovereign again. So, one of the reasons why we like to think we live in a more civilized time is that conquest, which is the norm throughout human history, has stopped. So I had this live experience of seeing the war in Ukraine sort of up close and personal. And I also had a lot of thoughts about how Britain had been influenced by its own imperial inheritance because of the Brexit debate that kicked off in 2016 with the vote to leave the European Union. Not because so people who voted for Brexit said the EU is a new empire, and the people who are in the EU and were upset Britain was leaving said the British are behaving imperialistically because they have this old imperial complex. So everyone was accusing everybody else of being an empire. And, all the listeners in the States will know, for all, the good intention behind a lot of America's global presence, it gets accused of being an empire. Sometimes by Noam Chomsky and others domestically, but a lot of international critics. But right now, America says China's an empire in the sense that it's trying to spread its economic tentacles. So the reason I wrote the book is I was struck by the fact that the era of empires is over. We stopped having formal empires in the 20th century. And the US did a lot to help bring that about, in fact, and the UN and other things. But everyone still has this sort of sense of operating in the shadow of the era of empires. And I wanted to look at how that manifests in different parts of the world, just as a way of giving a different way of conveying to a sort of a lay audience, not an expert audience, why the world and our headlines are full of so many nasty, miserable disagreements, and how if you're a pessimist and you looked at the headlines, you keep your money in your wallet in terms of humanity learning from its mistakes. I don't mean to be the harbinger of doom, but I think that's a reasonable statement to make given the way that the world is.
When you look at this moment in history and the themes and topics you explore in this book, what other epoch in history is the one that we're living in most similar to, do you think?
So that's a really good question, and it's definitely not similar to the world wars in the 20th century, because the risk was countries would go bang on, head-on collision wars with each other, and 50+ million people died in World War II. And after that, the nuclear revolution and the detonation of atomic weapons by the US, the USSR, and then China, that sort of war that our grandparents' generations remember, that's not likely. And so the era that this era most represents in terms of international tension, I think, is actually the 19th century and the imperial era, where there is a lot of intense competition between very proud countries that had a lot of energy, a lot of money, and a sort of a desire and a will to expand their realms, and also to expand some of their ideals and systems around, or protect the parts of the world where those ideals were being practiced or had appeal. But they didn't want a head-on collision with each other. And you'll notice the historians amongst us will be familiar with the concept of the long 19th century, which is at the end of the Napoleonic Wars, so 1815, Battle of Waterloo, right until the outbreak of World War I, 1914, there was no World War. And yet there was all this intra-imperial tension. I think that's sort of where we're at for the 21st century, because I don't mean to keep going back to USA and China, but you just need to even glance at the headlines. There's a little bit of a blinking contest going on here. I don't think it's not an arm wrestle, but there is very much a sort of who's going to blink first on a whole range of issues. And I feel that they're not the only two. There's also Russia. There's also Turkey in its own realm as well. There's a lot of jostling right now. There's kind of jostling that I certainly don't remember, because I don't remember the Cold War era. I just don't think we've had it in the 90s and the 2000s. I think the world became used to an America that was very, for better or for worse, very dominant and unchallenged. And that's kind of what's falling away. So that's very unique to now, but certainly the 19th century and that era of imperial competition.
And when you think about what preceded that area following, eventually, like, if you move out of that kind of stasis where people are locked in this imperial tension, is the other side of that then all-out war, though? Is there some utility to be locked in this state?
Well, I suppose it depends on your pessimistic or optimistic view of human nature. Because if you take what I think is a very honest view of human nature, is there is greed, there's selfishness, and there are lots of countries which have a very self-referential view of how the world ought to be. If you take all of that into account, and you think, well, our biggest job is to save us from ourselves and our worst tendencies, then we've got to do something with those competitive instincts, just as you've described. And I think finding some kind of balance, so the competitions that are playing out in the world do play out, but we avoid some kind of horrendous conflagration, or we avoid some sort of smaller territory just being sucked up into a maelstrom of competitiveness. I'm sort of thinking back to the Cold War and, poor old Vietnam. I mean, I'm not making a judgment about it, but I've been to Vietnam, and I'm sure many of your listeners may have been there on holiday. You sort of think about how it sort of fell into the firing line of lots of other people's conflicts as well as its own conflicts. You don't really want a third country to have that sort of thing either. So locking in the big players into a position in which they're able to jostle but never overstep the mark, and try to avoid the fact that it could spill over into another country, which is unfortunately not beyond the realms of possibility, thinking the next 10, 20, 30 years.
I hadn't thought about this until just now. I'm sure that you have, because you've thought about this deeply, but what role do you see sport playing in this? Like, do the Olympics and like the international sporting community in these contests, do they play some kind of role in just providing another outlet or expression of these tensions, this physical manifestation of ideology, of pride, of conflict?
At the individual level, the philosopher Bertrand Russell, who was very anti-war, this is 100 years back or so, thinking about World War I, he'd often make the allusion to the fact that those competitive instincts could be, you pour a bucket of water over them rather than, putting on the camo face paint and preparing for war. He mentioned sport. He also mentioned mountaineering, which I think had a lot of glamour in the early 20th century. Said, listen, if you want to work as a team against the unbelievable odds with a lot of pride for your side, climb a mountain. And I think at the individual level that's completely true. At the country level, sadly, sometimes sports it can't be insulated from geopolitical tension, and we all know about the Russia doping scandal.
Yeah.
I mean, that happened, right? But a lot of Russia's international enemies were very keen to pile in and to make sure they were properly banned, because this whole idea of Russia as a rule breaker then became, well, we can show that in their sporting conduct as well. So it can backfire a bit sometimes and produce even more ill will. But, like everyone, fingers crossed we actually get an Olympics this year in Tokyo. We get a World Cup for soccer as well, hopefully, because those are really important things to bring the world at least into the same headspace for a little period of time.
And to rewind a bit, as you were describing how this idea came together for you for the current book, how does that idea come into focus for you, what is your practice, or what do you do to collect and organize your ideas? And with this particular project, when did it come into focus enough that you were like, okay, this is what I'm doing now? Like, do you capture stuff? Do you handwrite stuff? Do you type notes? Like, what do you do?
So I've noticed this is my third book. I squeezed 2 out of my PhD thesis, so I've got a little bit of a sort of muscle memory developing now in doing this. I've noticed there are sort of a couple of different approaches at the very fundamental level. One is a sort of exploratory, I'm going to start writing, and sort of by the end of it, it's almost a totally different thing to what I started. And others, more meticulous plotters and planners, and I'm definitely the latter category. So I start with an end in mind. And actually, the sort of rest of the world title, The Great Imperial Hangover, is sort of popped into my head. I mean, it's as close as a sort of a light bulb moment as you can imagine. But, they do happen. And they happen to people in all sorts of creative pursuits. So that came. And then actually, originally, it was going to be only about Britain and the different ways that the British Empire's end has influenced Britain. But then very quickly I decided to make it about different parts of the world, aforementioned Russia, China, India and others. Once that structure was locked down, you break it down and you think, right, so it's 80, 90,000 words, but there's 8 or 9 chapters. So that's about 10,000 words a chapter. So you want this to be manageable, right? I imagine if I'm running a marathon, I maybe think about it in blocks. I don't think about 26 miles or how many kilometers. That's just going to blow your mind. So you've got these chapters and you think, right, that's the length of an academic journal article, 9, 10,000 words. I can do that. And then you sort of try and break it up into a production line process. That's all good and well, but like anything that's difficult, when you're about 1/3 of the way through, you're wondering why you even started, because the sleepless nights begin. The chapters that start to be written and look terrible just haunt you. Writer's block, I always find, is not a very effective expression, because actually what it is it's an inability to progress when you know what you want to write, but you somehow can't express it, and so what you're expressing is poor. So you're not blocked from progressing. You can't express it at a higher level of quality, or when you read it back, it's just rubbish and it doesn't convey anything you wanted to convey. And of course, because I cover so many different parts of the world and a lot of history and current affairs, you frequently tie yourself in knots. And the ultimate thing about it is it's a very monastic process. And even if you have editors and a publisher, you kind of suffer on your own as a writer. But that's part of the joy.
And when you do get stuck, what do you do? Do you walk away from the work? Do you let it sit? Or is it like brute force? Do you try to hammer through it?
For me, it's absolutely brute force, and I felt that when I was, and this is put on some very loud music with a very high BPM rate and just try and go for it. When I was doing the PhD, I used to joke with my course mates over in Cambridge. I'd say, listen, it's not about trying to be Socrates or Stephen Hawking or whatever. I think it's about being Rocky Balboa here. So when this great big giant brute of an obstacle just knocks you to the canvas, you do what he did, and you get up and you sort of fight through the bleeding forehead. That's kind of how I approached it. But I realize that doesn't work for everybody, because I'm quite happy to try to beast myself on this and try to exhaust myself. And for me, that's part of the experience. Other people would be very different. I don't necessarily think that that's the advice for everybody, but I normally try to just push through. I think normally if you hit your limit, get a good night's sleep, and hopefully the next morning your brain's somehow subconsciously ticked over the problem, and it somehow isn't as complex at 7 a.m. the next day.
Is there a time of day that you like to work?
Well, when it comes to delivery, if anyone's sitting there sort of thinking about writing a book, unfortunately, there's no substitute for just amount of time spent on it. So really, researching, I find you can do in dribs and drabs. You can accumulate the information with lots of breaks in your working life or your daily life. But writing, I think you kind of have to clear out space, because I find you have to factor in unproductive days as well, when your brain is still ticking things over, you're still processing. So I'd probably go for sort of quite full days. But I like to try to do it in a concentrated burst. So I wrote this book in a year. And unfortunately, with book writing, it's, how long is a piece of string? I mean, we could spend 5 years, we could spend 3 years. I mean, no one's going to tell. I mean, unless your publisher is literally going to, terminate your contract and cancel all mention of the forthcoming title on Amazon because you've failed to deliver. You can tell a publisher it's going to take me 3 or 4 more months, and they probably will say okay. So then that's the mental discipline part around, well, what sort of standard do you want to hold yourself to? And the way I like to look at it is, what's the opportunity cost of continuing to write this book? As I said to you, I want to oscillate to do something more practical. So the longer I'm sort of out here in my study on my own, making no friends, meeting nobody, and having no actual sort of interpersonal experiences, just here with the keyboard and the pen. Do I want that for 15 months, for 20 months? I mean, I did my PhD part-time. It took 5 years, and I can tell you that, that's when I actually went to Ukraine. In fact, going to a war zone seemed like a blessing compared to hammering away at a PhD.
Wow, you make writing sound so appealing, but I mean, I can totally relate. It's not an easy process, is it?
No, it is like, it is the proverbial mountain or race to run. It's horrible when you're doing it at times, but the view when you get to the top. I mean, getting that finished hardback, as I did just a few months back, the European edition of The Great Imperial Hangover. Looking at, it's a really nice shiny cover they had over in sort of the European edition. I sort of looked at it and I thought, I can't believe it. You guys have done me proud. You've made me look really good, because you still see these notes, these half-finished chapters, these scribbles, these thoughts that you were never quite able to bring to coherence in the way you wanted. But there's a process, there's editors, and just the whole process of bringing it into a published product really fills you with a lot of satisfaction and pride.
Do you read your reviews?
I do, and I've had an interestingly mixed bag. In the UK, I got a really nice review in the Financial Times, which I was delighted by. Yeah, because it's a really quality paper. But the flip side of the coin is I got lambasted in the Sunday Times, and I think I know what happened. Because my book is trying to say to the reader, listen, it doesn't matter where you're from in the world, your forebears experienced empires somehow, right? Maybe your forebears went off conquering. Maybe they great-great-grandparents fought the American-Mexican War. Maybe they're British and they conquered India. Or maybe your forebears were the conquered. Maybe you have slaves in your background. Maybe your family were colonized by the Portuguese at some point. Everyone has an imperial inheritance, and what I want to ask you as a reader is, how self-conscious is your government, is your system, are your country folk of that inheritance, how it makes them feel about themselves, other parts of the world, big problems in the world, trying to, assumptions of right of way and all that sort of thing. And I said some things about, traditional British assumptions around the empire, and maybe a bit of, dare I say, a bit of arrogance that comes out in things like Brexit. And I just got the wrong reviewer, because I think it rubbed him up the wrong way. And he was like, I'm going to go at this guy. So what can you do? Take the rough with the smooth. Dominic Sambrook's his name. I look forward to meeting him one day, I'll look him in the eye and I'll say, hey, listen, mate, you wrote this review, but you missed the entire point of the book. Do you want to look me in the eye? Because they think about these reviewers is they slightly hide behind the fact that there's a sort of a media machine and a bit of anonymity, in the sense that you're never going to find them. But, I'm not going to do anything to the guy, but I'd like to see what he says when you look him in the eye and say, listen, mate, your review missed the entire point of the book. What right do you think you had to criticize it? Go, here's your 5 minutes, look me in the eye. But there we go. You've got to be tough like that, and you can't be too demotivated. I always think use it to fire yourself up.
Yeah, and maybe you'll find out what Dominic's favorite Metallica album is when you meet.
I don't think he listens to metal. That's my conclusion from the whole episode.
Fair enough. So as you mentioned, you ended up in the Ukraine. Tell me a little bit about that. What were you doing there?
So going back to what we were saying about working on national security, and before that having an interest in military affairs. So I'm very conscious I've never served in the military, and it wouldn't be, always know your limits. It wouldn't be a career that I would thrive in. I'm a more of a sort of a cognitive guy, right?
Did you ever consider it though?
Absolutely. And but I think when push comes to shove, and I did a bit of I went to a few drill nights with the British Army Reserves, like the National Guard, effectively, and I quite enjoyed it. But it was never the sort of thing. I never got the impression this was going to be something I'd thrive at.
Sure.
Know where my skills are. So I spent 6 years in the British Foreign Service. This is as a civilian, as a diplomat, and we have opportunities to go do civilian work in war zones, and the sorts of jobs you could do in Afghanistan and Iraq. They didn't really appeal to me because you're sort of stuck in the green zone on the base. And everyone's a target for the suicide bombers and those sorts of things. But then in 2014, I'd been in the civil service for 5 years, Russia, Vladimir Putin, they made their move in Ukraine. And, as I mentioned, annexed Crimea and started this so-called hybrid war in East Ukraine. And there was a diplomatic mission out there with people from 50 or so nations, including Russia and America and Britain and lots of nations, that were meant to be out there monitoring the ceasefire. And I thought this is a really interesting opportunity to have those experiences of actually being in a war zone, being in a country that's experiencing a war, in a job I can do something practical and useful at, and a job that will actually give me a bit of freedom of movement. And so I sort of volunteered for this secondment out to this mission run by this diplomatic body called the Organization for Security and Cooperation in Europe. It's a hangover from the Cold War. Very briefly, when it comes to some sort of, not peacekeeping, but that sort of mission in East Ukraine, they're never going to let NATO in, the Russians, because that would be World War III.
Right.
The EU is never going to go their European Union, because Ukraine being tempted to join the EU was partly why Russia then decided to move in with the invasion to stop them from joining the EU. So the OSCE got sort of dusted off as this mission. And, we got some hostile environment training run by one of the partner countries and militaries. And we got quite a lot of intensive training upon arrival. A lot of my colleagues were ex-military people, a lot of ex-artillery officers, because there was a real shooting war going on. Yeah. And then our job was we had these up-armoured sort of white Land Rovers with the OSCE logo, to effectively monitor both sides of the conflict, to meet with armed forces on both sides, and to try to have a dialogue channel between them. And I should also add, this will be something that listeners will remember as an episode, the Malaysian airliner that was shot down, MH17, to actually go to the crash site and to be part of the recovery operation of the fuselage, and there was a specific team out there to recover human remains as well. So actually be able to access the war zone, different parts of the war zone as neutral observers, and to sort of try to hold everyone to account to the ceasefire, and ultimately not succeed to do that. That was the job.
What did it feel like to be face to face with that?
So, at a professional level, quite validating, because as a diplomat, you're meant to be able to work with a variety of people in difficult international situations. So I'm a Brit, I've got American colleagues, I've got Canadian colleagues, I've also got Russian colleagues, and I've got Ukrainians that we're reporting to, because of course it's their country, and you've got to make that dynamic work. That's professionally quite a good challenge to do. At a personal level, having thought about war and thought about these intense experiences, written about it, and then actually, someone's firing a massive artillery piece and it's not that far away from you. And I was in a city that was bombed at one point as well by a cluster bomb launched by the separatists. Fear in the pit of your stomach. The likes of which a good novelist like George Orwell might have been able to document when he went to the Spanish Civil War. But unless you've felt it, it's impossible, I think, to really intellectualize it. That plus, I guess, the fact that, all these ideas around, theories or strategies or whatever, it's not they go out the window, but the governing forces in a country in war and in an organization that's working in war, whether that's an aid organization, a diplomatic body, or a military organization, the emotional sort of subtext of day to day, the fear, the anger, the ambition, the pride, the greed, all those sorts of things, they become magnified because a country in a war zone setting is a country, it's not so much where there's no rules, but of course the rules are breaking down. And so your own self-identification as an individual, as a community of individuals, it's completely different to civilian life. That's the best way I can describe it. Almost like a lesson of a lifetime spending a year in that environment.
What do you feel like that taught you about people or human nature? Were there any new lessons for you in that experience?
Definitely. Certainly camaraderie, which is something that a lot of great novelists and writers on war document. That builds very, very quickly because the shared experiences are pretty intense. So you bond with people really quickly, and you bond with people who you'd otherwise never meet or get on with, different generations, nationalities, dispositions, and anything else. Also, the sort of the safeguards around the best and worst aspects of human behavior start to collapse a bit. I think it certainly reminds me, or really brought home to me, how bestial we are as creatures, because in everyday society we've got rules. There's a police force, there's roads, there's stop signs, everything else. Someone driving through a war zone, even as innocent, they don't have to put their seatbelt on, they don't have to stop at a stop sign. That's a very mundane thing. But at the same time, in their personal conduct, they might feel that they're exposed to such risk that their personal conduct, when it comes to money matters or the opposite sex or whatever, that then doesn't need to follow the same rules. And there's sort of a falling away of the inhibitions that I think a lot of them are bred into us by society, and for good reason, from school, from law, from civic education, being a responsible citizen. I'm really amazed. It's not quite Mad Max, but that sort of environment, I don't think we're ever that far away from that sort of environment, descending once again on parts of the world.
And day to day, when you were in the Ukraine, what was it like to go? I'm assuming like you're in a safe location that's orderly, probably in terms of where you're living, where you're interacting with your colleagues day to day, and then you're doing something like going to the site of the plane crash, or seeing human remains, or seeing artillery batteries firing at other people, and then going back to a safe area. What's it like at the end of the day? Like to go just kind of like pop in on something like that and then to be able to zoom out of it. I've never done that, so I'm just curious. It sounds like it must be a kind of a peculiar, intense experience.
Yeah, it is. And a couple of the places, because being a part of this big mission, you didn't get to choose where you got sent. So it wasn't holiday camp, so you kind of got sent somewhere. And actually the first place I was sent was because there's a front line still in East Ukraine. On one side there's the side next to Russia, the separatist rebels. Other side is controlled by the Ukrainians. First chunk of time I was sent over to the rebel controlled territory, and interestingly we were all holed up in a 5-star hotel that we couldn't leave. So unless we were going on patrol, we were stuck in this hotel. And that's a very weirdly claustrophobic sort of setting, because not that far were the rebels' artillery positions, and they'd fire these multiple launch rocket systems kind of over the hotel. I mean, there's no chance of hitting us. The arc is too high, so they just kind of arc over. But you sort of have we call it nightly fireworks. And it's amazing how quickly you become habituated into that as not being a threat to you, because it's being fired over you, and then it becomes a point of amusement. Obviously, that's insane. But it's just within a few days you become habituated into that. On the other side of the front line, there was a bit more of a normal life, as you were sort of describing, where you can go on patrol and then come back. It is quite weird, and different people deal with it in different ways. This goes back to the other point around human nature. Like alcohol consumption is a big thing. Bearing in mind this is Ukraine as well, so alcohol is plentiful and people down the spirits. I actually come from a teetotal family. Totally. I mean, I do like the odd beer now and again, but my drinking tolerances are not particularly great. I'm not going to be drinking and be under the table. That's never been like a thing I fall back on. But for a lot of colleagues, you're not their dad. You're not going to wave your finger at them. You sort of see them hammering away at the booze, and that may be part of the sort of the transition bit. I don't know. Other people become a bit sort of sullen and withdrawn, and sometimes you notice people become quite suppressed in their behaviors, but it all blows up over something minor. So you get this incredible, obviously the tension is building up. It's like the boiling frog thing, isn't it? And then something minor happens and people properly start yelling, swearing at each other. They sort of throw their proverbial toys out of the pram over an issue and I did this a few times as well. It's because of the tension building up and the sort of things you witness. And There not being any sort of outlet. I mean, it wasn't, I should say, it was a civilian mission. We did have mandated leave days, but sometimes actually getting out of that war zone was not that simple. So you might have had like an on-off rota, but sometimes your off day was you just sit in your hotel room and don't go on patrol, which is not really an off day because you're still in that geographical environment.
Did what you saw and experienced in the Ukraine change how you perceive people or human nature, or did it have any kind of lasting impact on how you view the world?
Yeah, hugely. So I think that plus in a totally different setting, some of my previous UK Foreign Office work was to do a counter-terrorism. So that brought you up to a slightly more slippery phenomenon in terms of, the depravity, the levels of depravity that people can go to in terms of, in the years after 9/11, the sorts of plots that were being, hatched against Europe and America and other places in the world. Certainly being in Ukraine means I'm a lot less surprised when dramatic and awful things happen. So we're having this conversation. It's less than a month after 6th of January and the storming of the Capitol building in the States. I mean, I just watched this on TV like everybody else, but seeing how people can want to close the gap between feeling impassioned about something and actually becoming quite violent about it, seeing people close that gap. And I don't want to trivialize it, but seeing sort of, there are a few jokes about cosplay, people like getting dressed up and then suddenly their dressing up fancies get a bit carried away. Well, in a war zone, there's an element of that too, because you find people piling in who don't actually have to. And certainly in Ukraine, there were people volunteering from both the Russian side and the Ukrainian side who were doing out of patriotic duty, out of a sense of adventure, out of this will make me a man. There's some pretty amateurish sort of, mobilizations going as well as the actual formal military presence. Thinking about terrorism, thinking about how self-starting many of the jihadist plots have been. When you look at the biographies of these guys and you see, well, so you were a sort of a keyboard warrior, radicalized, consuming internet material, and then one day your fantasy took over, and that's I want to act. And I'm not making any moral equalization between people taking on different causes, just at that human level. That especially being a guy, but also women as well. I'm getting through my 20s. I'm in my early 30s. Did I ever prove my mettle against this gigantic obstacle? And just personally speaking, Ukraine kind of I felt quite sated from that. I don't really have a great desire to go work in another war zone. I wouldn't rule it out. But I can see why people seek out those sorts of experiences as a way of testing their ideals, testing their mental robustness, and living up to the stories that they've heard, because stories are so powerful. Stories of their ancestors, fictional stories, stories of a superhero, even just something that triggers the imagination, that makes you think civilian mundane life isn't enough for me to feel like I've expressed myself, explored all the avenues of my potential and my being.
Is that something you feel like you might write about at some point, like in a more expanded format? Have you considered exploring that in something book length? Let me give you a book idea.
Yeah, I was going to say, not until this moment, actually. That's actually not a bad idea. There are a few books about like the sort of biology and psychology of why people fight.
Right.
There are a few out there, but I think it's not just about fighting and joining the military. I think it's about some sort of extreme action. The examples I gave you, by the way, of war, of terrorism, and of the insurrection, they're all political. That's interesting things. So I guess thinking about that theme, that really would be about, there's something about your ideals are on the line. I'm going to exert myself physically, but my ideals are on the line. I think it's that meetable. That's why it's different to sports. Sure, you can be an Olympic athlete and say, I'm going to take the flag of Japan and the flag of the USA to this global contest. But I do think, overtly sort of political conflict sort of settings, I think there's something different in them and how they test you.
And with what you're doing right now, like you mentioned briefly in our discussion, the Ukraine, this concept of hybrid war, could you talk a little bit about hybrid war, what it is, and how does that relate to what you're doing now?
Yeah, so that term wasn't really used very much before I went to Ukraine by academics and policymakers and journalists. And when I came back in late 2015, everyone was using it. And NATO had a hybrid war, countering hybrid war strategy. Yeah, I've got a love-hate relationship with the term. Basically, for those who aren't acquainted with it, it was actually pioneered by a U.S. Marine Corps veteran, Frank Hoffman. He's now an academic, really powerful intellect, a very mature view of the evolution of warfare. And he said your state adversaries like Russia, they're going to take on criminality, guerrilla tactics, insurgency, and your non-state opponents like Hezbollah, who face Israel, they're going to take on state-like characteristics of rocket brigades, maybe try build an air force or whatever. So in other words, it's mix and match. And the countries are going to go low down and dirty, and the terrorist groups are going to try to get as big and powerful in terms of what the arsenals they're bringing to bear as they want. So that was his idea around the hybridity, the connection between things that otherwise weren't really being combined. In terms of how that relates to my current role, it goes back to what we're talking about. World War III is not going to happen. Big countries have got nuclear weapons. Mutually assured destruction is still a reality of life, and it's morally disgusting. But at a practical level, there is a reason why we haven't had World War III, and that's one of the big reasons. But we've still got these big rivalries in the world. We've still got countries who. China is really fixated on its autocratic political system, and it thinks it's had a good pandemic response because of it. America is pretty wedded to democracy. It's part of its faith, and people have religious faith, almost religious faith in multi-party democracy. And I'm not knocking that at all, but those are pretty mutually incompatible. And so that's part of why you have these head-on collisions. And it's not just about those countries, but when countries can't go all out and fight each other, they find sneakier ways to snipe at each other, and there still is a potential of warfare happening, but you want to fight a war that's below the threshold of triggering that big World War III, and that's really what hybrid war is about. It's about finding a clever little mix that means you can either say it wasn't me, I didn't do it, or somehow it gets you your goals without causing a massive escalation. And that's kind of what Russia did in Ukraine. It annexed Crimea. And, a lot of people will not like me for saying this, but it kind of got away with it. Because, it gets a lot of criticism. It got sanctions, and Biden's going to go down hard on Russia, I'm sure. But no one's going to force it to give Crimea back because they probably can't. And that worked quite well. And over where I'm sitting now in East Asia, the concern is that China would find its own ways. It's already built artificial islands. It's laying airstrips on them. But could it find ways in islands around the Philippines or islands around Malaysia to suddenly sort of stake out a slightly bigger claim for itself? And not tomorrow, and the big one's Taiwan. We're having this conversation. Actually, the headlines have got just this week quite a lot about China's military incursions into Taiwan's airspace, and I don't think they're going to do a Normandy D-Day. Send the amphibious boats, and the plank drops down, and the Chinese version of Tom Hanks runs out and it's Saving Private Ryan. It's not going to be that sort of coastal frontal invasion. So what would it be? And how would the Chinese, thinking creatively, combine different aspects of modern technology, of the military machine they've got, of the political situation, and find a winning cocktail that gets them forward without triggering World War III? You can bet your bottom dollar that the people will be thinking about that.
Have you started chewing on what your next book might be?
So I also think there's a bit of post-book exhaustion. And one reason I'm not a career academic, by the way, I love my 4 years of teaching, it's really rewarding, is academics, certainly in Britain anyway, kind of have to produce book after book after book. And sometimes you sort of feel sorry for full-time academics. Sometimes in the humanities, and they're having to kind of write one for the sake of it to get a promotion. I'd rather wait till inspiration sort of strikes. So the short answer is no. I'll be writing a lot about hybrid warfare, about East Asia, and about some of the lessons of the Ukraine conflict. But in terms of a book, I think I need a bit of a timeout and get the creative juices flowing again.
A timeout indeed. Well, Samir, thanks so much for taking time to talk. I really enjoyed getting to learn more about you, hear more about your process and about your life experiences. If people want to learn more about you, where should they go?
So I've got a website, www.samirpuri.com. just my name. And other than that, you can also find details of under my book entry, The Shadows of Empire in the USA, which will give you sort of a bit of a bio about what I've been up to in the past.
After more than 2 decades working with the world's top performers, it's clear that there's an untold story lurking in the shadows behind every highlight reel, every podium top finish, and every flawless performance. Because behind those moments, there are countless failures, a lifetime of hard work, and a story and struggles that you just can't see. Everyone has had hard moments in their personal lives, in their careers, in their pursuit of becoming who they are. I know that I have. Over time, one major difference I've observed over and over between the best in the world and the rest is how they face obstacles, how they metabolize these crux moments, and what they do next. That's why I created this podcast. There aren't shortcuts or hacks on the road to being the best in the world or to just finding your personal best. My goal is to inspire and empower more people to set aside doubt, to be courageous, to walk through fear, and to reach beyond what they think is possible. And I'd really appreciate it if you could help spread the word about Choose the Hard Way so more people can hear the stories shared on this show. If you like what you're hearing, if you dig this episode, please take a moment to subscribe, to give us a 5-star rating, and to leave a review in the iTunes store or wherever you listen. It makes a huge difference in how the show surfaces in search, and it helps more people connect with the powerful stories that my guests share. Thank you for listening. I truly appreciate it. And remember, you are what you overcome. Choose the hard way.